and welcome to All Things EAP, a podcast produced by practitioners across the globe and hosted by Barleap. It provides a fun and friendly look at every aspect of EAP, helping you keep up with the latest developments and building an inclusive and equitable community around the world. Following the Barleap values, we hope to be collaborative, professional, developmental, and inclusive. Each episode will dive into an aspect of EAP with discussions, reflections, and insights from practitioners in different contexts. Whoever and wherever you are, we hope you find this podcast informative and insightful. Hi, I am so happy to be here with three fantastic EAP practitioners this morning. We have Jen, Katrien and Millie, who are all here to talk about the challenges in EAP materials design. So can I ask you very quickly to introduce yourself to the audience? Jen, can I come to you first?
Okay, thank you. My name's Jen, or Jennifer McDougall, and I work for the University of Glasgow in the School of Engineering, and I specifically work in transnational education. Our organisation is called Glasgow College in Chengdu and in Hainan in China. My role is English Language Quality Lead. I suppose I look after three different areas: curriculum design, professional development, working with the English language teachers, who are mainly early career EAP practitioners, and assessment design. In terms of materials, I suppose they cover both assessment and curriculum design. I've worked with materials for many years, but in this context, I was tasked with redesigning a curriculum, and so with another colleague, we wrote all the materials for our curriculum, basically. It took us about 2 years, and just as we were implementing the new curriculum and syllabus, COVID struck. So we had to redesign a lot of materials for online delivery on a week-to-week basis. So I guess that's my context.
Thank you very much, Jen.
Yes, hi, thanks, Laura. I'm Katrien Dereoy, and I hail from a little town or city called Bruges in Belgium, but I currently work at the University of Luxemburg in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, where I'm a professor of applied linguistics and language teaching. So I've got a dual kind of role in my job. I'm a linguistics lecturer, but I'm also an EAP practitioner. And as EAP practitioner, I'm also the head of the Language Centre, the University Language Centre. So I lead a team of adjunct lecturers. I've mostly researched materials and materials development for academic listening and research article writing, but also course development for EMI lecturer training. In my role as a teacher of EAP, I mostly teach doctoral students. So I'm aware that's quite a specific context. I should mention my research.
Please do. Please do.
My research is mostly on lecture discourse, but the lecture discourse informing materials development and lecturer training.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Katrien. Millie, can I come to you finally?
Yeah, thanks. So, hello everyone. My full name is Milada Walkova, but people call me Millie. I'm an associate professor in English for academic purposes at the University of Leeds. And interestingly, like Katrien, most of my teaching is to doctoral students. And how I'm interested in materials is because as an EAP practitioner, I develop materials for my students. So that's also our institutional culture, I would say, that we prefer to develop in-house materials than use textbooks off the shelf. And my area of expertise is using theory and research to inform pedagogy. So some of the materials I've developed can be seen in my book, Teaching Academic Writing for EAP. And currently I'm working with Nigel Harwood, who's a professor in applied linguistics at the University of Sheffield. And we're working on 2 edited volumes on materials in EAP. So one of these will look at materials at the level of lesson, and the other one will be looking at the materials at the level of a whole textbook, course book, and syllabus.
Brilliant, thank you. I want to start by talking about what some of the challenges are at the moment within EAP, not just within the UK, although I know that Millie and Jen, you're working within the UK context, but more generally within EAP. The challenges around EAP materials themselves and how we design effective materials. So Jen, could I come to you first?
So I'd say probably I'm not working so much in the UK context, although obviously it's informed by the UK context. So there's a kind of strange situation there, because I think that's one of the challenges is creating materials that fit your context. Mm-hmm. And context is everything, whether that's the subject the students are going to be working within, their discipline. That's part of the context, the country they work in, and their background. I think context is really important. I think I've written down 4 key challenges that I would say in terms of developing materials. So the first thing is, who are the people who are using these materials? And that includes both the teachers and the practitioners. That, I think, is a key challenge. Something which I think is hugely challenging is related to time. And this is time to develop materials, but it's also thinking about how much time people have when they're using materials. Because as a writer of materials, you sometimes have your own vision of how you would exploit materials. That doesn't mean that can happen in practice. Finding appropriate materials for your context is obviously a challenge. Millie and Katrien said that they work with doctoral students, but I work with students who've just left high school, so it's very different in that context. The last point I put down as a key challenge is developing materials and activities which have intrinsic interest. How do you make sure they're engaging and interesting to the body of students and the practitioners going to use them?
I just wonder, with this last one, the intrinsic interest, did this come to you because you have encountered materials that are intrinsically boring?
I think we, as writers of materials, we do have our own style and our own way of thinking about things that may be what we find intrinsically interesting. I might find a text and think, oh, this is great, it's got a great narrative within it that I can see that I want to read this. But I do have to consider other people. One of the things that I feel about that is how we use feedback to inform new iterations of materials.
Thanks. I think it's really interesting, the breadth of the challenges that you've highlighted there. I wonder, Millie or Katrien, have you got other challenges that you would add to Jen's list?
Yeah, so I think it's also a lack of training, that most EAP practitioners don't have training, so therefore they might lack confidence. And one important implication of that is when they look at published textbooks, they might think, oh, this must be good because it has been published. So they might believe that materials that are published will be superior to whatever they can produce. Mm-hmm. But there is research that shows that's not necessarily the case. For example, Katrien's paper on lecture listening course books shows that textbooks are often not informed by theory. When people lack training and confidence, they can think that they can't do it. And it's also very time consuming. So if they don't have the time in their workload to develop materials from scratch, they might choose to use somebody else's materials.
That's a really good point. And I wonder then if there is a responsibility from institutions who are committed to high quality teaching and high quality materials to provide that time and that support to practitioners. And I'm sure this is something that has come up in all of your institutions at some point, but feeling like you don't have enough time, particularly practitioners who are newer to institutions, who might have higher teaching loads, less time, that they're not supported in developing those essential skills in order to create effective materials. Katrien, is there anything that you would like to add to that list?
Yes, all of the above. I think for me, it's how you incorporate research like research literature to inform your materials, own data analyses of corpora, of student output, and allow for personalization when you're teaching a heterogeneous audience. So I, for example, teach research article writing to always a disciplinary heterogeneous group. And this means that although I've written materials that I can use every time, I've written them in such a way that I get student output and input that allows me to personalize the workshops that go with them. But that means it's always a race against time to adapt the materials to that particular cohort. And I think also what I've seen from my team and from other people who develop materials, it can be a challenge because many of us are linguists or have some kind of linguistic background. And so in our materials and our teaching, we may be using terms that we don't necessarily need to use when, for example, teaching engineers. So it's kind of simplifying the complexity of our linguistic toolkit in teaching and applying that. I think the issue of, as Jen said, to provide materials that are intrinsically interesting and motivating, that's become even more important in this era of AI, where you really have to look at how you can develop tasks and content that kind of incorporates AI, allows them to use AI while kind of circumventing some of the pitfalls that come with that. And if you're developing materials for people on the team, they've got to be usable by other teachers with minimal explanation. So they've got to be really clear. Also, to come back to the point that Jen made earlier as well, we want to actually teach more than we have the time to cover in any course, or that the students have time to process. So I think those for me are some of the challenges.
And I wondered if we could talk about what informs your own personal approaches to material design.
I kind of wanted to pick up the points about writing for other people, not writing materials that you're using yourself. Because Katrien mentioned you want to have materials which don't need that much explanation in a way. But actually, in my context, I've found that a lot of my teaching guide for the materials has almost been methodological training as well as the actual materials, because there often has to be a kind of explanation of why things are being done in the way they're being done, especially people who are new to EAP. So you're almost building training in with the materials that you're developing. So that's another challenge, but that informs my approach. When you look at people like Tomlinson and his kind of exposition of different principles that we should be looking at, I think these kind of help a lot. Another thing that informs my approach is thinking about equality, diversity, and inclusion. Something that is underpinning the types of materials I'm using, who is available or represented in those materials, so that the viewpoints that the students are seeing represent diverse communities.
It's important also to consider how our backgrounds can influence our approach to materials design and these other things, because it doesn't happen in isolation. These other things all play a part in how we approach this. So, Katrien, would you like to share what informs your approach and your process in materials design?
First, I find it really interesting how much overlap there is between what we're saying, because I could repeat most of what Jen said. For me, I think first and foremost, it's about what students need to do with what we're teaching them, so that our materials and tasks are representative of what they need the training for. Another one for me is, and it goes hand in hand with the being representative, is personalization, because everybody's needs will be different. And that's my first principle, I think, my priority. And a second priority is to look at the relationship between the materials and what you do with them in the classroom or don't do with them in the classroom. So for me, I try to limit classroom time with doctoral students because they've got so many competing demands on their time. And so it's all about the added value of the time you have together in the classroom, which is why I will talk about this later. I often use a flipped classroom approach, also allowing for the materials to be used for independent study and continued learning.
So maximising not just the value of the time that you have in the classroom, but the value of the materials outside of the classroom as well.
Yes, that's it.
Which goes back to, I guess, the challenge that we identified earlier, which was lack of time for everybody, lack of time with the students, lack of time for ourselves in being able to work with them. Millie, you mentioned earlier that part of your interest in materials design is the lack of theoretical underpinning. So how does this play into your own approach to materials design?
Yeah, so I would say that in my approach, I think about three things: content, level, and format or activities. And in terms of content, I do my best to make sure that my materials are informed by linguistic and educational research and theory. So, for example, last week I was developing materials where we looked at complex language. And for that, I used my knowledge of research, which talks about, okay, what is complexity in academic written discourse? What structures are used and how do students develop their knowledge? Because it's not like they go from one stage to another, but they go through several stages. And you have to kind of think, okay, where can they be and how can I help them to get to the next stage? And at the same time acknowledging that they will be at different stages. Now, as Katrien mentioned before, there's a lot we need to know, but we don't necessarily need to tell all this to students. So we use it to inform the materials, but we have to be mindful how much of that theory do we need to make explicit. So I make sure I don't use technical terms, but I use student language to help them understand concepts. When you're developing materials, there's much more you need to know than what can be shown from the materials as a product. And that's why I don't like using someone else's materials, and I don't like producing materials for others, because we can come to the same learning outcomes using different theories.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Millie was saying about the idea of having an informed approach to what you're doing. I think that is actually one of the difficulties for people who are at the start of that journey with writing materials, actually, is sometimes they want to tell everything that they know about something when that's not the point, really. And you need to strip that out because that's not what the students need to learn, depending on their context again. However, you do have to build in this idea of rationale for why students are doing things. But that's different than using a lot of meta language and technical terms.
Yeah, if you've come off the back of a master's or a diploma level training course and you're very keen to show what you know, it's hard to exercise restraint. But yeah, that restraint is necessary, I think, to prevent the students from feeling overloaded and unnecessarily derailing classes and going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, so just to come back to two of the points that have just been mentioned, I think indeed enough room needs to be left for application. I think that's always when I'm writing materials as well. It's like, okay, well, I've got the theoretical background that I want to convey and include in my materials, but really students learn by not by being told things, but by being made to do things. So there needs to be enough space for them to apply it to their own tasks or texts or whatever. And the second thing, I think, when Millie said as well about teaching with other people's materials, in a way, it's so enriching to research your own materials. And when you teach with your own materials, I think it makes you a better teacher as well, because you've got a wealth of knowledge that you have gained from doing the research, which is not necessarily in the materials. And that's something you cannot really pass on to somebody else who teaches with your materials.
I think that's very true. Another complexity is that I can talk about my own context in TNE, where we have 500, 1,000 students all on the same course, we do need to have a level of consistency in what the students are taught in order for it. I totally agree with Millie and with Katrien that there are different ways of doing that, but that does come with experience, and there is that kind of support mechanism that providing materials can give. What there needs to be, and I've learned over the years that I've been working in China, is that actually our materials need to have more flexibility in them to allow people to then adapt, maybe having something as a base, because starting off from nothing is actually quite complex as well. It's another context for that is on pre-sessional courses where you have very short courses with very specific outcomes. It is hard for people to be creating all their own materials, and at least when we create in-house materials, they are specific to the context that we have, which is different than published course books, which tend to have that global, perhaps not that useful feel to them.
So it is challenging when you have larger cohorts of teachers and of students to create materials that work across the programmes. When I personally work with quite a large cohort of students, I teach the same lessons with them multiple times, and they are always realised differently through the materials. But what can we do to acknowledge this in our materials design if we are teaching large cohorts?
For example, when we give answer keys, they're not answer keys, they're sample answers, or they are potential answers. Caveat that there will be many different answers coming into the room and that you should work with those. So I think making that explicit, there isn't well, sometimes there's a right and a wrong, but often as you said, there's a realization it changes depending on who's in the room, what is said, because a lot of it is discursive. Something else that we do is through our professional development work. We have 1 week each semester that we work with the teachers. And for example, when we're inputting any new material, we actually get the teachers to try out the experiments or try out the tasks. And that can inform what happens in the classroom then, because they can see it really in action in a group.
I think it's a really interesting idea. So do the teachers really see the value of this?
Yeah, I think they do, because they also get the chance to input on what they have done in the classroom and what has actually happened. It gives it its own space, and therefore people can really engage with each other, try out things, have ideas about how they may have used the material in a different way and what the outcome was, trying different things with it.
Great. It sounds like it's definitely worked for you and that you've been able to integrate this into your practice. So I wanted to focus in on something that we've touched on a little bit, which is how we design materials for different students. How do you design for different students within single cohorts where there are different disciplines, different backgrounds, potentially even different levels?
I've written the ebook for the course with different chapters, and a week before we have a workshop, they have to submit tasks from a particular chapter that we're going to deal with in the workshop. So they read through the theory, then they do tasks which are applied. For some of them, there is a key, but for many of them, it's actually asking them to apply it to their own writings. At the end of each chapter of reading, they have to give me feedback on the usefulness of the materials. I think that's an important way. It's been an interesting way to find out how useful, what's missing, what's particularly useful. And I ask them to tell me what was unclear and what in particular they would like me to explain again, and any other questions they've got about the topic. This really allows me to personalize. So in the workshop, I don't actually go through all the theory from A to Z again. I just highlight the main points. I illustrate it with samples from students' writing, and then we can also deal and discuss with any questions that have arisen I must say that from student evaluations of the course, this level of personalization and really working with their output and allowing them to learn at their own pace from reading through the theory is extremely valuable to students. Also, as a corpus linguist, I encourage them to create their own corpus with Antconc. Maggie Charles has written at length on this, and Tatiana Karpenko has also written a book about working with corpora in EAP for academic writing. And so this also gives them the tools to explore their own discipline, their own genres, and also to continue learning.
Great, thanks, Katrien. Millie, how do you cope with the challenges of working with different student characteristics in your teaching?
So I think I try to look at what might they have in common in terms of their knowledge. So when I'm developing materials, I'm asking myself, what are they likely to know already? And what are they likely to struggle with? And what misconceptions are they likely to have, even though we've taught them before, someone else has taught them before? What works for me is to know the kinds of cohorts, because when you have experience of teaching particular cohorts, then you can kind of assume and expect what they're likely to know and struggle with. And it's much more difficult when you're developing materials for a new type of cohort, and especially new students that you haven't met before. And Jen mentioned at the beginning the importance of context. So for me, that's also an important consideration. So for example, I'm asking myself, am I developing materials for a standalone workshop or materials that are part of a course? And if it's part of a course, then I feel it should be embedded within the course. So for example, instead of introducing yet another text, I try to reuse texts we've looked at before. So that means when we recycle the text for a different type of activity, for looking at different aspects of academic language, then the students are not distracted by the content of the text because they're familiar with it, and we can go straight into working with the language. Now, if it's a standalone workshop, this is much more difficult because you also need to choose a text to start with. And Jen talks about how it needs to be interesting and relevant to the students, not just to you. And for me, the difficulty is that I teach EGAP classes, and I always get feedback from students, oh, we want to read something from our discipline. But then I ask them, okay, you're in engineering, would you like to read about design? You're in design, would you like to read about engineering? You see, we're in this class together, so we can't read all texts from your discipline. So what I try to do is to select texts whose content will be relevant to everyone. It's not always immediately obvious to the students because they're so focused on, oh, I just want to read about my discipline. But for this week, I developed materials using articles from PLOS ONE, which is an interdisciplinary journal. Some of the papers are really accessible and interesting to wide audiences. So, for example, we looked at a paper that talks about whether tweeting increases citation counts. So something that will be very relevant to doctoral students who will publish research.
I think something that you said, Laura, earlier about teaching the same thing to different groups. I've done that as well in the past, in the same week, like teach the same thing 6 times. And what I've learned from that is not to immediately ditch your materials when they don't work with one group, because then you go on to another group and think, oh, it works in this group. And that's something to do with group dynamics sometimes. So trust your materials and don't just kind of bin them or think you have to change them straight away if they haven't worked once. I think to come back to the point of, it's interesting when Millie talked about thinking about what your student needs are and how we use our intuition and our experience for that. One thing that experience has taught me, unfortunately, is when I used to ask doctoral students in the first session or in a pre-course survey about their needs, there was very little awareness about what the real needs were. They come up with surface things like vocabulary and improve my whatever for writing. Another thing that I haven't mentioned that I think perhaps is an important part of how I develop materials is that how I teach that things are activity driven. So I try not to present any theory that the students could come to themselves through doing an activity.
Mm. Can I just add something there about working with different students, different materials, different disciplines? For me, being embedded within a school which is related to the degree programs that I am working with has been immensely helpful in terms of having access to the subject lecturers and being able to talk to them about the issues they see, but also being able to kind of deep dive into what it is they use and how they use things. Because sometimes, and I think this comes back to Katrien's work on lectures, sometimes what's in materials, so for example, what they say is the way that a lab report is written, is not actually how it realises itself in what the students are given to produce in their discipline. And having that ability to collaborate and glean information from the subject area is immensely helpful in how you design those materials.
Yes, I think that's important, Jen. It reminds me of that's always the first step when I'm developing a new course for doctoral students for their pronunciation. They've been referred on to me by their supervisors. And the first thing is I talk to their supervisors. I try to talk to the people who referred them, or if a new course needs to be designed by one of the adjunct lecturers or myself, they get in touch with the program director. This collaboration with people who can be informants.
There are so many things that you have given me cause to think about as we've been having these discussions, and sadly we're not going to have time to cover all of them. Some of the things that sprung to mind were obviously the ubiquity of AI and how this will have an impact on how we design our materials, but also the continued discussions around how we support neurodivergent students with accessibility and disability issues, and even, particularly in the UK at the moment, decolonisation of our curricula. We'll put a pin in those for now, not because they're not important, but because we want to do those justice, and we'll definitely have more discussions about those in the context of materials design in the future. So the last thing I want to do is to ask each of you to, in your wisdom, pass on some advice. And we're going to jump on the trend of what advice would you give to EAP practitioners designing materials if you weren't afraid to hurt their feelings?
Okay, don't be afraid of criticism. That's my first comment. Writing materials is an iterative process, and so you can't be too precious about something that you think is brilliant, especially if you're writing for other people. They will tell you. You need to let other people see your materials. You need to get feedback. You need to be willing to change things. Find ideas from everywhere. Another piece of advice is, if you can, think about taking some additional training. Because I did a TEEP course where I had the chance to really deep dive into some types of materials and open them up and look at what I thought was the way that a genre was written, was created, or what the language surrounding that was. And I found out lots of really interesting things that have helped inform me.
Only agree with that, Jen.
If I can pick up on that indeed and get student feedback, which can be critical, also input and incorporate it to enrich your teaching and your materials. That's the first point. And the second point, John Sinclair said, trust the text. But when it comes to textbooks, don't trust the textbook, as Millie also says. Do your research, read the preface. Think, how did they come to this content? Is this representative? Is this really what's going to be useful for my students? And also, don't just go on your own gut feeling or your intuition about what you should be doing or should not be doing and what the proper way is to go about it. Do your research.
What's your advice?
So I would like to start by reiterating, as Katrien said, don't trust published materials, but be critical of them, evaluate them. Are these particular materials good? Why are they good and why not? Are they good for your particular group of students? So trust yourself over published materials. And do your research, as Katrien said, and as Jen said, try to learn. And if you don't have access to a course, I would say use literature. So I would recommend Brian Tomlinson's books and the book by Frida Mission and Ivor Timmis. They are not EAP, they are ELT, these books. But you can still learn a lot when you think about, okay, how does material design become principled? What principles do I need to think about when I'm developing materials? I would also say start slow. So start by adapting, which probably most people do anyway, and then add an activity here and there gradually. Collaborate with others. If it's time consuming, you can consider collaborating with people from other institutions so that the same materials can be used in more than one place. And then evaluate how they worked. So you get feedback from colleagues, from students, see how your materials worked. So next time I produce a different set of materials, what have I learned from this to improve my materials for a different class?
Thank you so much, Millie. That brings us to the end of our very rich, very enlightening discussion. I want to say thank you to Jen, Katrien and Millie. It's been a brilliant discussion, and it's only the beginning for our discussions around materials design. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We really hope you've enjoyed it and that you found something interesting or useful in it. And we hope that you can join us for the next episode. So if you'd like to share a comment, suggestion, or an insight into something that we've talked about, please send us an email or voice note at podcast@barleap.org. You can also get in touch through our YouTube channel at All Things EAP. Take care. Bye-bye.